The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the IT Governance webinar on ISO 27001 and an internal ISMS audit. Each of you should have on your screen the option to use a chat feature to post any questions you would like me to consider or raise areas expand upon slightly more as we go. I reserve the right to hold those questions to the end of the session, but please do raise them as they crop up, and if I can accommodate them in the flow of the session, I will at that time. So we've got up to approximately an hour where I'm going to be discussing the standard or the specification, ISO 27001, that's the 2013 version of that international standard, and specifically the requirements for an internal ISMS audit within it. So ISO 27001, as those of you who have been following the webinar series that we've been delivering will know, is the internationally recognized specification or requirements document for an information security management system. Before we get into the detail, I should introduce myself. My name's Steve Watkins. I'm one of the executive directors here at IT Governance. Oh, there you go. I first started working with information security management system standards in the mid to late 90s. I was responsible for running the first accredited certification project for an information security management system, and that was building on a fair few years' experience of working with management system standards before that. If I fast forward to now, there are some of my credentials on the screen. All reads very well and good. There are a number of national and international committees that develop standards around information security management, and there's a couple of them referenced on the screen there for you. So the international committee responsible for the publication and maintenance of ISO 27000 series of standards is SC27. The SC stands for subcommittee. It's a subcommittee of the parent committee JTC1, Joint Technical Committee 1, which operates under the guidance and governance of two international standards organizations, ISO and the C. Those two, so SC27, I'm a member of SC27, that's the International Standards Committee, and there are number of national standards committees around the globe that mirror the activities of SC27 and contribute to it. The one for me, my local one here in the UK, where I'm delivering a session from this afternoon, is IST33, and I've recently inherited the chair of IST33, that role, to help brigade our contributions into some sort of sense and order when we submit them to the international committee meetings. I've also authored with Alan Calder, our chief executive at IT Governance, what has become the Open University textbook for information security management systems, now in its 6th edition, IT Governance and International Guide to Data Security and ISO 27001 / ISO 27002. We'll be reflecting or talking about those two standards and some others as we proceed through the next 50 to 60 minutes of conversation, where we will, of course, at the end come across or move on to the opportunity for you to ask questions if you haven't raised any as we go. Before we do that, though, let's talk briefly about IT Governance. We're a one-stop shop for governance, risk management and compliance activities, covering all of those issues and a couple more, I'd suggest, that are demonstrated on the screen. We support and work with our clients in a number of ways through offering publications, so books, articles and the like. We deliver a variety of training courses at a variety of levels. We have employed consultants that work with clients to ensure that they can reflect the requirements as appropriate to them in their organisation and the environment in which they operate. And we also have a software company that publishes or licenses solutions for organisations, and that includes both information security, risk assessment and management software, and e-learning solutions for another. Initially, our early successes were very much in the information security management system arena and ISO 27000 specifically, and more recently, as you might expect if you follow related topics through social media and the like, it's moved into privacy being a very big hot topic right now across the globe. As an organisation, we have offices in the US and Europe, and consultants employed across the globe and service our clients from local expertise where necessary. On to the focus of today's discussion, the requirements in ISO 27001 and specifically the requirement for an information security management system audit. If you can bear with me just one moment, I've just got to overcome an issue on the screen. There you go. Right, so we're going to be looking at why would anyone want to audit an information security management system? Let's face it, creating an information security management system requires a lot of effort and resource. It's not a task to be undertaken lightly, and by the time you've put in time, effort, money, become at times, I'll admit, stressed over the progress of the project and start to establish an information security management system that's reflecting the organization's requirements, why on earth would you then want to go through the trauma of an audit? Well, we'll be exploring that, and hopefully we'll be exploring how you can avoid the audit activity being overly traumatic. To achieve that, we'll be looking at the specific requirements in ISO 27001 for internal audits. We'll be looking at the different roles involved. Obviously, you need auditors, but you also need people to be audited. And there are a number of other roles that come into play in audit activities. We'll be looking at what's called the audit criteria. Those are the requirements that an auditor bears in mind when, or should bear in mind, when conducting their audit, how an auditor goes about conducting an audit, and what happens following audit activity. And then, of course, we've got the opportunity for questions and answers using that chat feature, as I've mentioned. You're all currently on mute to save any of us listening to crying babies, barking dogs, that sort of thing. And so if you do hear any, please help, because my office would have been invaded and we need some sort of assistance to address that. Hopefully we'll avoid that, but hey, let's see how we get on. Back to the focus of the session today. First thing I want to explain is the different types of audit. There's a number of different auditing relationships that many people don't necessarily realize they're discussing when they refer to an audit. So they're typically referred to as first, second and third party audits. A first party audit relationship or an internal audit is where an organization, your organization or mine, commissions an audit on its own activities. That audit is where the organization effectively self-examines, and that's what the majority of our focus during this session today is going to be upon. Many of the aspects and hints and tips that we cover today will of course hold good for the other types of audit, but primarily we're focusing on this internal audit activity. Second party auditing is supply chain auditing effectively. So that's where your organization might choose to audit its suppliers to determine the degree of assurance and comfort that you can derive from their arrangements, or indeed your clients might choose to audit you as an organization so that they can determine the amount of trust they can put with you. Third party auditing or certification or registration audits generally, majority of the time, focuses on the process whereby an independent audit or registration body would be engaged by an organization to go in and conduct an audit, and as a result of the audit, award a certificate of conformity, assuming of course that's the conclusion of the audit activity, issue a certificate of conformity and maintain a register of organizations that they have issued certificates to. That's akin to the, or also known as the accredited certification scheme. Third-party audits also covers legal and regulatory audit activities, but generally most people end up referencing the certification or registration activity that you might expect from large recognised audit bodies, such as some of them in the States I'm aware of in the ISMS arena, Perry Johnson registrars, ECOGRA, I believe, Shellman, and the like. So this session, as I've said, is primarily focused on the first party or internal auditing. And with that in mind, we should ask ourselves, why would you want to audit an ISMS? Well, here's some suggestions as to why. Apart from the fact that we're describing this experience as an audit, the items on the screen now, to me, seem to suggest that it's a good thing to do. If the audit is managed well, it can indeed be a worthwhile experience for everyone involved. Ensuring that the arrangements the organisations put in place conform with the requirements, and that the processes it relies on, and it's the interconnecting processes that deliver the management system that delivers the organisation's objectives, ensuring that those processes are systematically and repeatedly communicated, understood, executed, and performed so as to be effective, has to be a good thing. On the right, we see the objectives recognised as associated with audit activity. So it's to determine the degree of conformity or non-conformity, typically with defined audit criteria or the requirements. And that is a driver of ISO 27001 clause 9.2, the clause that focuses and addresses internal ISMS audits. Other objectives of audit activity is to determine the effectiveness and to provide the opportunity to improve. Already mentioned the reference to clause 9.2 of the standard, so let's have a quick look at some aspects of that clause. If an organisation is claiming to conform to the requirements of 27001, then it needs all the requirements of 27001. That includes clause 9.2 of the mandatory management system requirements. Those that have been subscribing to the webinar series will be familiar with the structure of 27001. There's the management system requirements, the mandatory management system requirements in clauses 4 through 10. And then at Annex A of the standard, there are a selection of information security controls that an organisation can deploy as it sees fit to deliver an information security stance that it's content with. We'll return to that shortly. So the requirements for, or some of the requirements in 27001 for an information security management system internal audit is that the audit activity determines whether the information security management system not only meets the requirements of the standard itself, a good thing if the organization has set the objective of determining conformity with the standard or operating and implementing an ISMS that conforms with the standard, but also the organization's own internal requirements. And those, again, that are familiar with the structure of 27001 will understand that 27001 requires the information security management system be informed by the context of the organization. That contextual activity includes identifying the interested parties and their specific requirements for information security. Conforming any organization confirming that it has factored these requirements into its information security stance has to be a good thing. That audit activity, as described or defined on the right, the definition of an audit, is an independent process for comparing audit evidence being objective and verifiable, and evaluating it against the requirements, the audit criteria. As we've just seen, those are typically the standard itself and the organization's own ISMS requirements, which are informed by the context. Before we get too much into the activity of the actual audit, let's have a look at when it might be conducted within a classic ISMS project roadmap. In our experience, and we have worked with many organizations implementing an information security management system conforming with 27001, most want to implement an ISMS by following the clauses of the standard, starting with section 4, which is context, moving through 5, leadership, to be honest, typically skipping 5, leadership, moving on to 6, which is planning, where the risk methodology and acceptance criteria, conducting a risk assessment and producing a risk treatment plan, and the SOA, the statement of applicability, come into play. And then they get on with implementation, which covers sections 7 and 8 of the standard. So there's the supporting activities, and section 8 is the operations. So implementation, training and awareness are covered through 7 and 8. And then at section 9 of the standard, there's the requirement for performance evaluation, which covers things such as monitor, review, management review, and indeed the requirement for internal audit. By the time an organization has reached this stage of the project in a classic roadmap or project approach, they have implemented the vast majority of the ISMS and start to conduct audits to inform continual improvement. Typically, we find organizations that when they go for certification audit by an appointed registration body, then struggle to demonstrate that the internal audit is effective, because the time lapsed between internal audit activity and the certification audit isn't sufficient for them to be able to demonstrate that it's driven improvement in one guise or another. Realistically, you could start performing internal audit activity much earlier in this classic project roadmap. So you could indeed, once you've implemented any aspect of processes to reflect the requirements of 27001, you could start auditing them. Indeed, there is technically a case whereby, or theoretically a case whereby, you could start doing audits before you implement the project. You could preempt the findings, of course, by saying that we've not actually had a project to derive conformity or drive conformity, and therefore we're going to expect that non-conformity is pretty much across the board. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. However, once your project has progressed and any of the arrangements are implemented and in place, you could audit that activity to inform improvement, thus generating evidence of the audit being effective and informing continual improvement earlier in the timeline, hence more evidence available come the certification audit. So when to start internal audit is a choice for you, your organisation, and how you choose to approach it. With regards to the specific audit activity, the key questions are these. Does the designed information security management system, or that part of it that's being audited, reflect the requirements in 27001? Does the ISMS reflect the requirements of interested parties and the organisation's risk appetite? Is the ISMS effective, and is it likely to be maintained appropriately? Is it delivering the results that are required? To achieve this, the requirements in 27001 for auditing are thus. So 27001, simply setting out the requirements, states that the organisation needs to plan, implement and maintain an audit program. So an audit program is a series, one or more audits over a period of time. For each of the audits in the audit program, the organisation needs to define the audit criteria and the scope for each audit. So if you have an audit program covering an ISMS, you may want to divide it into manageable size audit activities, and each of those audits would have an individual audit scope. The sum of the audit scopes over one cycle of the audit program typically covers the entire ISMS. There are a number of ways you can divide up the ISMS, and we'll touch on those briefly in a couple of slides' time. 27001 again requires, being the source of requirements, requires that the organisation selects auditors, and I would suggest that if you're familiar with the standard, you might want to think about section 7.2, where 7.2 of 27001 requires that the organisation determines the competencies it requires of roles within the ISMS. Internal ISMS auditors is certainly a role within the ISMS for which I would expect an organisation to have defined what it requires as competence. So identify the auditors to conduct the audits, ensuring independence appropriately. The results of individual audits need to be reported, as does documented evidence of progress against the audit program. So that's a set of requirements. That's all very well and good. However, it doesn't actually give us many pointers as to how we might solve or meet this challenge. That's where a number of other standards come into play. So here on this next slide, we have a couple of the players involved, the roles involved, and some of the standards. So we have here the auditor, the person actually conducting the audit. Over on the right, we have the auditee, that is the organisation or individual being questioned and interviewed, working with the auditor, hopefully, working with the auditor to deliver an effective audit and identify the areas of conformity and non-conformity so that improvement activity might be undertaken. The audit focuses, of course, on the requirements, as we have here in the bottom right-hand box. Those requirements being informed by the primarily by the standard ISO 27001, by the management system itself, so the ISMS, and then various laws, regulations, and contracts. These all form the audit criteria or the requirements. Now, with regards to the standards, 27001 is the one international standard that sets the requirements for an international for an information security management system, but there are a wide number of other standards available that provide guidance on various aspects of management systems. Those relevant to auditing start with ISO 19011. ISO 19011 provides guidance on generic management system auditing. There's a wide number or variety of management system standards. 27001 happens to be the one for an information security management system. Some of the other more popular standards are ISO 9001, which covers quality management, ISO 14001 for environmental management, and those more related to the ICT, IT governance risk compliance arena could be ISO 20000 for IT service management and ISO 22301 for business continuity management. It doesn't matter which of those standards we're considering, which of those disciplines, each of them have a requirement for internal audits of the management system, and ISO 19011 gives generic guidance on how to go about auditing a management system. Now, 27000 being specifically focused on information security, it has its own guidance documents in the form of 27007 for guidelines on ISMS auditing. So that's auditing the management system requirements of 27001, and the standard ISO 27008 provides guidance on auditing the information security controls. If you bear with me just 1 minute. So 27007 and 27008 are the ISMS specific guidelines for auditing information security management systems and the aspects of it, and ISO 19011 gives you the generic guidance on running an internal audit program or an audit program and regime. The guidance in 19011 starts with bear with me. There you go. It starts with an audit program. Talking of competence, I might need to improve my competence on using the GoToWebinar interface. Never mind. Right, so an audit program. Many implementations of an information security management system overlook how the design of the audit program itself might support and indeed change over time to reflect the changing objectives of the organization and the ISMS. So here on the screen, typically we'd start towards the top left where we've got the established audit program objectives. So very early on in the establishment of an ISMS, given that it's going to become ideally business as usual and managed on an ongoing basis, the early audit program objectives would be to ensure that the designed ISMS conforms to the requirements of 27001. Over time, those audit program objectives might move on to be more associated with improvement activities to inform improved effectiveness and economy, as an example. Let's stick with the early objective of achieving certification. Certification is awarded on the basis of conformity to the standard. So right at the outset, it could be heavily driven by the structure of the standard itself. As a result of the establishing the audit program objectives to ensure that certification is achieved, if that's one of the high level objectives of the ISMS, then the audit program would be established, and that's using an approach of dividing the ISMS into manageable sized audits. The program's then audited and delivered, rather, implemented and monitored as it progresses to ensure that it's delivering in a timely manner, which is then in itself reviewed at management review. Management review is required to consider of the internal audit program and how it's progressing, and that itself could inform improvement or changes to the audit program objectives. This is very similar to what you may be familiar with as the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle associated with management system standards, but in this case applied to the audit program itself. Means by which you may divide up the information security management system, well, they're varied. Typically, where the primary objective is to deliver certification to the standard, we would expect to see the internal audit program divide up the ISMS by criteria, by the actual requirements. So adopting a clause by clause and control by control approach. The pitfall that many organizations fall into here when undertaking this activity independently is that they look at Annex A of the standard, they see that there are 14 headings, a couple of those categories of control are not particularly detailed, and so they might group them together to end up with 12 control audits and spread them across the year. That's all very well and good. However, focusing purely on the controls means that the organization isn't benefiting from auditing itself against the mandatory requirements of 27001, the management system clauses. As we saw on an earlier slide, the standard itself at 9.2 requires that the organisation audits itself against the requirements of 27001, and therefore an internal audit program that focuses purely on the information security controls would not satisfy the requirements of 9.2 because it's omitting the mandatory aspects of the standard in its considerations or its audit criteria. Organisations that start with this clause by clause and control by control approach, after one, possibly two cycles, start to realise that, okay, certification or registration's been achieved, time to move on with the approach to the audit program and divide the ISMS up in a different manner. This can frequently move to be a geography, department or team-based approach where the auditors consider the relevant aspects of 27001 along with the specific processes as they apply to a specific department, team or geography and conduct audits on that basis. Often organisations then mature their approach through to a process approach where they'll select possibly say a client experience and consider the client experience through first contact with the organisation through to post-sale support, let's say, considering the information security aspects and consequences throughout that entire life cycle or experience. Typically, for those organisations that move any of their audits onto this process, at this stage of maturity, they would indeed adopt a blend of the approaches above. In doing so, of course, they need to remember that they are auditing against the specific requirements or the audit criteria as demonstrated on the left. They are 27001 specifically, and those requirements in the organisation, so ISMS, which are of course informed by the contextual requirements, so specific information security requirements of interested parties. There is lots of guidance available, and again, harking back to a previous webinar in this series, there's the implementation guidance available through 27002. 27002 providing something like 100 sides of text in guidance as to how to implement or what to consider in implementing the 114 security controls in Annex A of 27001. That implementation guidance uses words such as should, could, and may. They are not hard and fast requirements against which an auditor could conduct an audit. Therefore, they are not audit criteria. The statement of a security control, however, in 27001 Annex A uses the words shall. In 27002 is exactly the same wording of the control with the word should replacing the word shall. So the wording of the security control, if the control has been selected by the organisation and its ISMS, and you would identify that from the statement of applicability, then you can effectively, as an auditor, audit against the control or the organisation's deployment of the control. The implementation guidance is useful to bear in mind and consider to help the auditor inform where they're focusing their attention and what questions they might ask. Some of the controls in the 27,000 series are not immediately obvious as to the scope of the control or the breadth of the control and what it actually covers. So that implementation guidance can be immensely useful. Reflecting on how the control is deployed within the organisation and the effectiveness of it needs to be informed by the purpose for the deployment of the control in the first place. And here we have a graphical representation of how a control might be informed. So starting from the left-hand side of the slide, we've got requirements identified from context would inform the deployment of a control, and the information security risk assessment activity would result in a risk decision which often engages information security controls from any source, NIST, COBIT or otherwise. In deploying those controls, 27,001 in section 6, the planning section, it mandates that the organisation compares the controls it has selected to deploy against those in Annex A to make sure that there aren't any that have been inappropriately omitted. This results in the risk treatment plan. The risk treatment plan maps the various implementations of the selected controls against specific risks so that the objective of the deployment of those controls can be fully appreciated. That informs the operation or the implementation of the system. And this is where an internal ISMS auditor focusing on controls should have an understanding or want to develop an understanding of why those controls that they are auditing have been deployed and what the objective of the deployment of the control is. The spread of controls in Annex A is massively wide, and the blend of controls can be particularly complex and in some areas technical in nature, not specifically or limited to IT technology, but it could be physical or other technical considerations that an internal auditor, particularly in a smaller organisation, could find a challenge to get to grips with. And this is where the roles of people involved in information security auditing, there are various roles, and you may want to deploy some others. So some terms to do with the players, if you want, in the audit show. There is the audit client, that is the organisation or individual that commissions the audit. For an internal audit, that would be the management of the organisation. There's the auditee, that covers both the organisation or the scope of activities to be audited and the individuals to be interviewed. There's then the audit party, consisting of one or more auditors, typically an individual auditor for internal audits, frequently for second or third party audits at supplier or certification audits, that may well be a team of auditors. So one or more auditors, frequently accompanied by a technical expert. Technical experts assist where the technology or the solution or specific processes being deployed are of a nature whereby relatively generic auditors will not necessarily have the expertise to interpret what they're seeing appropriately to be able to derive an appropriate conclusion. Occasionally, auditors will have observers, so that could be auditors in training or people monitoring their performance as an auditor, and in some circumstances, interpreters or translators, where the audit activity is taking place of people with a foreign language. Talking of auditor competencies, here's a list of a number of areas where an information security management system auditor should be able to demonstrate knowledge and understanding. The definition of competence in the standard is the ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve the intended results. So true competence would be not just having the knowledge, but being able to apply that knowledge and the associated skills to conduct effective audits. The areas of knowledge for an information security management system auditor understandably include 27001, information security, and auditing skills and training. At the same time, you would like them to demonstrate the traits on the right-hand side, and this would assist greatly in the audit activity. Of course, the skills and competencies for an audit need to be appropriate for that audit. So for internal auditing, the focus of today's discussion, it would depend very much on the scope of the individual audit. More typically for second and third party auditing, where audit scopes frequently covers the entire ISMS, it would be more relevant to consider the context of the organisation or the environment in which the organisation operates. No matter what the context of the organisation or the type of audit being conducted, the success of an audit is massively reliant upon the preparation that goes into it. Here you've got an indication of the balance of time and effort put into the various phases of conducting an audit, and you can see the effort going into preparation here. To help with the preparation activity, we would suggest that the assignment of an audit should be communicated early on. So you have an audit program that identifies a number of audits over time, and ahead of time, ahead of when the audit is due to be conducted, both the auditee and auditor should be informed so that a date can be set. It also gives the auditor sufficient time to prepare for the audit. They need the relevant information and to pull on that information as listed on the screen there to inform their audit activity. One of the key things any information security management system auditor should be considering right from the outset, of course, is whether they have the appropriate permissions to access the evidence and information they need to examine to confirm conformity or otherwise. When it comes to conducting the audit, the auditor should, with every interviewee, introduce themselves and the purpose of the audit, explain what the process is and what the outcomes are likely or could possibly be. They would then conduct their interview, ideally using open questions to elicit information and then to ask for evidence to demonstrate that activities are being conducted as explained. The auditor will then report on what they have found, and it's massively important that the audit report is balanced. Far too many audit processes and activities recognize purely or solely the negative aspects of findings. So they focus on non-conformities and observations. Very seldom do you see a list of finding headings including or a possibility of a finding heading that is conformity or area of good practice. There's the need to close the meeting with the auditee, so the auditor would summarize what they found and close out the activity, which could well result in a follow-up audit to ensure that activities arising out of the audit, so the improvement activities addressing any concerns or findings, are effective. That typically falls to the next internal audit in that area as part of the next audit cycle in the audit program. Having said there's a need to balance the focus between positives and negatives, there is definitely an art to documenting a non-conformity. A good auditor documents a non-conformity in a manner whereby it is very clear what the non-conformity is and which requirement it is documented against. It's inappropriate for auditors, management system auditors, to advise or steer to a solution. It's up to the area or the individual responsible for the area where the non-conformity was found to determine the appropriate action to address it. They are, after all, the ones that have the required competencies to manage that area, or so the ISMS would suggest. Having said that, yes, this art to documenting a non-conformity, we would encourage all auditors to ensure, and indeed auditees to challenge non-conformities that might fall away from these requirements. That being that a non-conformity consists of a specific requirement, the finding, and a clear statement of what the non-conformity was. This is an adaptation of the generic guidance in ISO 19011, the generic management systems auditing standard. And this informs the improvement activity that immediately follows. Clause 10 of the standard, 27001, is not only called into play as a result of findings from internal audits, however, it is most definitely relevant to internal audits. So where a non-conformity is raised, there is a requirement that the organisation takes action to control and correct it. There's a requirement the organisation determines the need to eliminate the cause. The whole risk-based thinking of management system standards means that it's not the case that any non-conformity instantly needs to have the root cause eliminated. A risk-based approach recognises that some things will go wrong, and that if they do not A, hurt too much, or B, occur too frequently, it could well fall within the risk appetite. In that scenario where a non-conformity has occurred, but it's within a risk appetite, the risk appetite of the organisation, correction is appropriate, but corrective action may not necessarily have to follow. So these activities under clause 10, improvement, which let's face it is one of the key goals of an internal audit regime, is to drive or focus on these areas. So for generic management system standards on the left, it's to focus on the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the management system. More specifically, with regards an ISMS, is to ensure that ISMS evolves in light of a changing world. So the concept of continual improvement with regards to the 27,000 series of standards recognizes that if the information security management system stands still in a changing environment, it effectively regresses. So it's required to continually improve in order to remain fit for purpose in a rapidly changing environment. So it's evolution, it improves the efficiency and improves the effectiveness of the ISMS, is the ISMS specific take on the generic management system improvement focus of suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. So by driving these things in a properly managed internal information security management system audit program that's resourced with competent personnel, it should deliver these top 5 headline benefits. And delivering those benefits from an internal ISMS audit regime pretty much brings me to the end of what I wanted to say today. So in summary, I'll just briefly reflect on these items. So to the top right, we have a reflection on the roles of people in the audit activity and the key standards that are relevant. Of course, there's one set of requirements in an ISO standard, that is 27001. That forms part of the audit criteria, the rest of the audit criteria being the requirements the organisation identifies as required itself. The auditor and auditee need to work together. The auditor can manage that process through adopting the guidance in other international standards, 19011 being providing the generic guidance on auditing management systems, ISO 27007 focusing specifically on the auditing of the management system clauses of an ISMS, and 27008 on the security controls. Clause 9.2 of 27001 requires that an audit program is established and each audit within the audit program is conducted. So the audit program in the middle at the bottom of the slide there, and the conducting of the audit at the top left. Whatever the scope of each individual audit, it's important to remember how the processes in scope or the clauses in scope or the specific controls in scope interact with the rest of the management system. That's the purpose of the graphic on the bottom left. It is a management system, it's not a series of separate individual requirements that need to be addressed. And to the bottom right, we have the roles or people that might have a role to play with regards to audit activities. On this whistle-stop tour through audit and internal ISMS auditing, we've covered quite a lot of material. So there are some other options that you might want to consider accessing to assist you in addressing your information security management system needs through these sorts of solutions, all accessible through our website, itgovernanceusa.com. There are specific training courses related to implementing an ISMS and auditing an ISMS. Indeed, the lead audit course, it's a 4.5-day course, so I've not done it any justice today in cramming it into an hour, any audit activity, but the lead audit course covers what's necessary to conduct first, second and third party audits. It lasts 4.5 days. And indeed, we're running one online on the week commencing the 16th of April. And I believe there's a few places left, so you might want to take advantage of that. One way or the other, please do stay in touch. There's a number of means of staying in touch displayed on the screen right there. And all that remains is for questions, if anyone has any. I'm just going to go back to the previous screen whilst I give you an opportunity to raise questions if you have them. Please use the chat feature available on your GoToWebinar interface to raise questions if you have them. Any questions? I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so I guess in the absence of questions, I'm going to say, oh, there is one. Hang on, I've just got to find it. The relationship. Okay, so the question's around 27,000 series and GDPR or privacy regulations in general. So ISO 27001 covers an information security management system requirements. So protection of information, the confidentiality, integrity and availability of information. Privacy has a massive overlap with that. Although privacy practitioners will claim that privacy has some requirements that an ISMS doesn't necessarily address. There's a couple of national standards that have been published for a privacy information management system. One that I know the British Standards Institution has recently launched globally is BS 10012. It's a personal information system specification. That is structured on the same high-level structure as ISO 27001, and there's a direct read across from it to 27. There are, at an international level, other standards being developed that are an even closer match and address privacy issues. So ISO 27552, the numbers just keep coming, don't they? ISO 27552 is going to be a bolt-on to 27001 to address privacy issues, likely to be relatively similar to BS 10012. I suspect. I don't know. I suspect. So an information security management system can certainly be used to derive conformity with privacy regs and requirements. It's a case of factoring them into your considerations for risk and information security risk assessment and management, and deploying appropriate controls. Specific areas around permission for gathering data, processing data, retention periods, lawful basis of processing, etc., specifically need to be considered relevant to the jurisdictions in which you're operating. Hoping that, I think that's covered off some of the questioners raised there. Any other questions? Let me just scroll through and check that I've not missed any. I don't think there's any there. No. Okay. So thank you very much. That brings us pretty much to the end of our hour. I hope you found that useful. Please do stay in touch, and we have more webinars coming up in the not too distant future. So keep an eye out, and hopefully you'll join us again then. Thanks very much for your time. Bye-bye.